Chapter 17, Lylan 12.13, March 28, 2311 AD. They were nearing the end of the tour, and Emma and Rosa Carter were soon to receive their blessings, to merge with Daniel Dwyer, to receive his thoughts as he shows them their every experience since conception as he connects his mind with theirs. Deliverance of a blessing allows his children to relive their lives and learn, benefit from the experience, and to see themselves as he sees them. No one was ever the same after undergoing the blessing. It was a truly enlightening experience and is said to awaken the mind. For Emma, it was a moment thousands of years in the making, and it was fast approaching. Lylan would soon emerge face to face with the demon at last. Finally, she would have her revenge. The exhibit commemorating the lost cultures of the world was massive and highly interactive, but it was one of the least popular stops on the tour. Only the passing few who took an interest in history prior to the rise of Daniel ever found it very appealing. Most remarkably, it promoted and celebrated the reasoning behind why Daniel had done what he'd done. According to the propaganda spewing from the display, it was for the benefit of all that there should be only one spoken and written language, one system of measurement, one currency, and that all people should celebrate the same holiday so that they may rejoice as one. This was not instituted overnight, but rather was a byproduct of his having fostered all the children of the world over generations. He taught them all to speak, read, and write only in English, and celebrated only the holidays that he chose to celebrate with them, including Knowledge Day, Hannah Dunn Day, and Patrick Foster Day. He taught them to use the blend of English and metric systems of measurement that was known to Hannah Dunn, and produced enough of a new currency to replace all that which was in circulation with a new unit. He called it the dollar, the Dwyer dollar. As the generations of humans that came before died off, much of that which was formerly common practice, some well-established religious and cultural holidays, age-old oral traditions through the retelling of family stories, the twisted versions of history forced upon the conquered, the furtherance of lies passed down to them from on high by their subjugated ancestors, resulting engagement in pagan rituals, belief in false hope, blindness, ignorance, prejudice, hate, war, pain, hunger, fear, it all simply ended. Everything anyone could ever want to know about anything throughout recorded history is accessible through this interactive exhibit, the curator said. Daniel was once quoted as saying that no fiction he has ever encountered encompasses the drama of reality the way that a history book does. Daniel encourages everyone who has an interest to drink from the wealth of this fountain. What is taught in the education curriculum is but a drop in the well of all there is to experience. The main monitor displays selected video and still photographs that feature in the interactive program. Ask any question you like, and then follow the trail. According to Daniel, the program is adaptive, and given enough time will eventually take the inquisitive mind through a complete and thorough telling of human history. No single person has ever exhausted the content of this masterwork. In order to read, listen to, and watch all of the content available before you in this display, in its current iteration, would take 67 years, 15 weeks, 2 days, 4 hours, 8 minutes, and 7 seconds. Try it out. Simply step up to a kiosk and ask a question. Anything that you want to know about anything. Emma was one of the few who actually took a great deal of interest in this exhibit. She knew so much about the present, and knew as much about the past as anyone, but there were no dedicated historians in the 24th century, no accessible minds for her to glean the information from. It was not a job in the restructured world. None were employed as such. Daniel felt that it no longer served a purpose. His people didn't need historians, they had him. They could seek out one of his emissaries and ask him themselves, or find the approved literature and read about it for themselves if they took an interest in history. So, though Daniel provided more factual information than anyone could possibly digest about the history of mankind to the public for their consideration, few ever delved deeply into the stores. And Emma herself could not see, and therefore was at the mercy of the interests of others, and the limits of their expertise. Emma was interested in everything, though, and longed to know everything. She wished that she could interact with the display herself. She had seen the exhibit many, many times before, through the eyes of so many throughout her life, but had never actually seen it herself. Yet here she was in front of another interesting display, and she was again thwarted from enjoying being in its presence because of her blindness. Even though she was standing right in front of it, she still had to see it through someone else's eyes. Rosa was not particularly thrilled, and she only played with the interactive displays briefly, asking simple questions and getting complex answers that were too long to retain her interest, before asking Emma if she wanted to see anything else. Emma, aware of Rosa's anxious desire to move on to the last exhibit, and then on to receive her blessing, said, "No, I know you want to keep moving. Let's go." She was further discouraged that she would soon be in the presence of what she considered to be the most interesting, most compelling exhibit, and would again be there and not at the same time. Damn her eyes. She would have to settle for experiencing the death of Daniel Dwyer through someone else's eyes yet again. Even though she'd be standing right in front of the commemorative display, she would never actually look at it. She couldn't. She was blind. She could tell day from night, light from dark, but that was all. The 12th vessel, like the 11th, was blind, and with good reason. If the demon was allowed to become privy to her sight, everything would crumble, and Lyland's plan would fail. But Emma Carter had been born blind as intended, and everything was happening in exactly the way Lyland had foreseen. The demon didn't stand a chance. Daniel Dwyer 13, January 1st, 2045 AD. Daniel awoke at 5 a.m. sharp as he always did and looked into his 8-ball. Then he got dressed and looked into his 8-ball. Then he walked down the hallway toward the bathroom to brush his teeth, paying no mind to the strange woman who he'd left sleeping in the chair that had been placed next to his bed as he slept. When he'd finished brushing his teeth, he looked into his 8-ball. Then he walked to the kitchen and retrieved a bottle of water from the refrigerator and looked into his 8-ball. He went with his water bottle to the spare room that had become their home gym, and he looked into his 8-ball. He drank from the water bottle, looked into his 8-ball, and then set both the bottle and his 8-ball down on the shelf, and he began his exercise routine. The doctor was watching through the system of cameras he'd installed to monitor Daniel's actions, watching and waiting. Maybe, he thought, maybe if there was one person on the earth that could make real contact with his patient, it was Hannah Dunn, and he was anxious to watch and record their first interaction, or at least her first attempt to interact with him. It was only a few minutes before the sound of his rhythmic breathing and the clang of the workout equipment roused Hannah, who sprung from the chair upon waking, and upon seeing Daniel was not in his bed, excitedly walked toward the sounds. She felt like a kid on Christmas. She walked past the bathroom door, then paused, backed up, and ducked into the bathroom. She looked into the mirror, fluffed and batted at her hair until it was teased to her liking, undid the top button on her shirt, and pulled her pants up tight to show off her behind. Then she continued on down the hall. She peeked in through the open door and then casually leaned against the door jamb, shifting her hips to show off her form, and said, "Hello, Daniel." He did not acknowledge her. He continued working out. He did not speak to her. He did not look at her. He seemed altogether oblivious to the fact that she was in the room with him. Hannah moved around to stand in the path of his forward stare, but he did not fix his gaze upon her. He looked straight through her, no matter how close she got to him. She spoke again to him as she walked toward him. "Hi, Daniel. It's me. It's Hannah." He continued on as though she weren't there, using the weight machine to do curls as she drew closer and closer. She was only a few feet from him, and was just opening her mouth to speak when he suddenly stood up, startling her, and she let out a quickly stifled shriek in response to his sudden movement. He paid her no attention whatsoever. She was stricken by how tall he was. He moved abruptly to the treadmill, powered it on, and began walking, staring ever forward into the void beyond the empty wall. Hannah caught sight of the closed-circuit camera on the ceiling and stared into it for a moment. Dr. Foster stared right back at her through the monitor in his office and sipped his coffee. It was unfortunate. This was precisely the outcome he'd expected, exactly what he'd anticipated Daniel would do, and he was disappointed. But that was one of the hard facts about reality. Hope does not aid in any manifestation but that of dissatisfaction. In a way, it was progress. In science, every failure is a success, but it sure didn't feel that way sometimes. The doctor had hoped that she might be able to reach him, but he did so without faith, for he'd done so without sufficient reason. He'd only hoped, as hope was all he had. Hannah followed Daniel to the treadmill, again trying to talk to him, and said, You saved me twice, Daniel, do you remember? She paused. There was nothing. Daniel, can you hear me? He continued to ignore her, and reservedly frustrated, she looked instead to the 8-ball face down on the shelf where Daniel had set it down. She went over to it and picked it up, and turned it over and inspected it. So, this was it. This was the conduit through which Daniel Dwyer channeled his knowledge, his weapon of choice, the tool of the dark vigilante. She set it back down where she'd found it and continued to watch him work out. He was built very well, and his physical power became very clear as she watched him lay into the heavy bag and felt the force of each impact through her feet. Dr. Foster entered the room and watched Hannah watch Daniel. She pretended not to notice that he was there, never moving her line of sight from Daniel. Then, as Daniel abruptly moved over to the sit-up and crunch station, she spoke to the doctor and asked him, "Is he ever here? Is he always gone?" The doctor thought for a moment, looking at her from the doorway, and then he said, "Well, I've never met him, and I've known him for 30 years. She slowly, dramatically moved her gaze to the doctor, a river of thoughts flowing through her head, and asked, "Why is he like this?" "I don't know," he said, and sipped his coffee. "He is an empty shell, and yet so much more than that, as you know." She slowly turned her eyes back to Daniel, processing what she was learning about him. "I don't know anything, Doctor. Tell me about him." "Call me Patrick," he said. "His workout is almost finished. Take the 8-ball and see what he does." She, moving slowly, deep in thought, picked up the 8-ball and held it in her hands. "What will he do?" she asked. "Just watch," he said. Daniel finished his crunches and then got up and made a beeline to the shelf where he'd left his 8-ball. He approached the shelf and went to grab it in the spot where it had been. His hand made the shape as though he was clasping the ball, but the ball was not there. He then turned his hand over and stared into his empty palm, the back of his hand hovering just above the shelf, and he stayed there. He did nothing but to stand there and stare into the upward-facing palm of his right hand. He'll stand there presumably forever, doing nothing until the 8-ball is returned to him. In the asylum we ran all sorts of tests on him, but we never figured out the cause of his condition. He is completely unique in the entire world, the doctor said. There is no precedence for this, Miss Dunn. I think that maybe we're not supposed to know how he does what he does, but only why he does it. "Call me Hannah," she said. "Of course there is no precedent for him. He's a miracle." "Okay," the doctor said. "Give him back his ball. Just put it in his hand." Hannah placed the ball in Daniel's hand, the viewing window facing up, slightly askew. Daniel reached up with his left hand and adjusted the position of the 8-ball, lifted his right hand and gazed into the ball. There wasn't even time for a response to appear in the viewing port of the divination toy, but he reacted all the same. He grabbed his water bottle and drank from it, and then he looked into his 8-ball. He then immediately left the room and went into the bathroom and closed the door behind him. The shower could be heard turning on. "You know that you can never leave here. I presume that won't be an issue," the good doctor said, well aware of her fanaticism and her ethics. "No," Hannah said, "none at all. I planned on exactly that, Patrick." She was charming, even more gorgeous in person. The doctor looked forward to having a woman around the house. He said, "You will be under constant surveillance. It's necessary to record Daniel's incidents of disappearance. When someone needs him, he goes to sleep and goes to watch over them. If things turn bad, he intervenes. Sometimes he's asleep for just a few minutes, sometimes for hours. But I record every time that he day sleeps and look for corresponding sightings of the spirit." "Then it is him," she said, as if hearing the doctor say it was what made it so. "Oh yes, Hannah," he said. "There is no doubt in my mind Daniel Dwyer is the spirit. I have catalogs of data to support the conclusion. I would bet my life on it." "And every time he goes to sleep," she asked, "he saves someone?" "He currently day sleeps about 10 to 20 times per week," he said. "About 10% of the total recorded daytime sleep occurrences coincide with sightings of the spirit. I know 10% sounds like a small number, but it only represents alleged sightings that were reported, and it is more than enough to make a connection. And I have a hypothesis. I think that sometimes he watches people's interactions, anticipating the need to appear and intervene, but then things don't end up going badly and he doesn't. I think sometimes he sees that he may need to intervene and he waits and watches, only to have the potential aggressor change their mind and not warrant his appearance. I have no evidence to support this whatsoever, but it would explain why there is such a disparity between the lengths of time for which he stays asleep. Sometimes the longest of his bouts of sleep wind up accounting for nothing. That's what lends credibility to my hypothesis. I think that maybe he goes to watch when someone is afraid, and he waits to allow for free will to be what it is and the situation to become what it will. And I think that sometimes he returns to his body without having appeared to anyone because the person he went to watch over is deemed safe by him, and not because of anything he did, but because the right choices were made by those involved in the situation and the need for violence, the need for his appearance, was averted. "Doctor," she said. "Patrick, sorry. Do you have a pen and paper that I can use?" She sat at the dining table and waited for Daniel to join them as the doctor had said he would, listening to the doctor as he explained more about the mortal side of the spirit. He follows instructions remarkably well, with a few exceptions. He doesn't focus on anything except for his 8-ball. He doesn't speak, and he doesn't write. The only time he was ever known to have written anything, he wound up, Hannah cut him off, finishing his sentence, getting arrested. "Yes, that's right," he said. "Hannah, how did you figure out who he was?" "That was it," she said. "I made the connection between the little boy with the 8-ball and the spirit. It was pretty obvious, really." "That's what I was afraid of," he said. "Did you tell anyone else?" "No," she said instinctively, then, "Yes, one person. One of the people he saved a long time ago. They won't tell anyone. I have complete faith in them." "What was his name?" he asked. "I'm not going to tell you that," she said. "I would no more betray them than I would you or Daniel." "So it's a girl?" he asked, watching her for a reaction. "It's a person I trust," she said. "Let's leave it at that." Daniel walked into the kitchen wearing his daytime clothes and sat at the table perpendicular to Hannah, and he looked into his 8-ball. He sat awaiting his breakfast, looking into his 8-ball about every 10 seconds or so, and doing nothing more. "I hope you know what you're doing," the doctor said. "As far as the world is concerned, you are now dead." "I know," she said, looking at Daniel, still dumbfounded by how much he differed from the picture she'd had in her head. "It was the only way for me to live, for I am now where I was always meant to be." The doctor continued cooking breakfast, ham, eggs, and buttered toast served with orange juice. Hannah refused his offer to make her a plate, claiming that she wasn't hungry and letting him know also that she was vegan. She looked sad, so the doctor tried to cheer her up and said, "Try giving him a command." "Like what?" She perked up a bit. "Anything within reason minus those things that I told you he won't do. He won't communicate. Go ahead, tell him to do something. Just don't ask him to go outside. That's not allowed and he knows it," he said. "Okay." She watched him look into his 8-ball. "Daniel, stand up." He didn't do anything. He just sat there. She threw a glance back at the doctor and then continued to watch him. Then he looked at his 8-ball again. He stood up so fast that he knocked his chair over, and Hannah again stifled a scream to a chirp and jumped in response. Then he stood there and looked into his 8-ball, and then he just stood there. Hannah started laughing, and the doctor joined in. Then he said, "Come on, ask him to do something else." Hannah said, "Okay, Daniel, crack that window a little bit," and she pointed at the kitchen window. Daniel looked into his 8-ball before the doctor had processed what she'd told him to do before he could say, "No, Daniel, wait, stop." It was too late. Daniel walked up to the window, took his right arm up with the 8-ball in hand, and swung it at the window, causing the glass to splinter. Hannah put her hands up over her mouth to hide her smile, but could not hide her surprised laugh. The doctor couldn't help but to laugh as well, and then he said, "Well, good thing you brought money with you, 'cause you're paying for that. There's your first lesson. Be as literal and explicit with your instructions as you can be, and keep them simple. Daniel, come, place your chair where it should be, sit down and eat your breakfast the way you did it yesterday." Daniel stood in front of the cracked window with his blank stare facing forward. A few seconds later, he looked into his 8-ball, and then he did precisely as he'd been instructed. He walked back over to the table, brushing past Hannah, her hair whipped by the wind he'd left in his wake, her heart a bit aflutter simply from the magnitude of his size, attracted to him, despite him being seemingly empty inside. It was the epitome of unrequited loves.